There is a number that gets repeated in nearly every conversation about scientific publishing. 90% of papers are never cited. It sounds devastating. It sounds true. And it is not. The figure traces back to a 1990 analysis by David Hamilton, published in Science. Hamilton counted citations across a broad set of journals and arrived at roughly 90%. The number traveled. It appeared in editorials, in keynotes, in op-eds about the state of academia. It became shorthand for waste, proof that most science is ignored. But the data behind it were never clean. Hamilton's sample included conference proceedings, minor regional journals, letters, corrections, and editorials that were never meant to be cited in the first place. When researchers later recalculated using only research articles in index journals, the real number was different. In medicine, about 12% of papers go uncited. In the natural sciences, roughly 27%. In the humanities, it is higher, around 80%. But the humanities operate under a different citation culture. The 9% figure was not a lie. It was a measurement applied to the wrong dataset, and nobody checked. That sentence, "nobody checked," is the subject of this video. Not because it describes one error, because it describes a pattern that connects every story this channel has told so far. A cartographer mapped the ocean floor. Recognition took decades. A submersible dove deeper than any human had gone, in a vessel held together by improvised engineering. A giant snake was labeled a crocodile for years because the vertebra did not match anything in the catalog. A parasite that rewires human behavior, present in roughly a third of the world's population, was dismissed by the medical establishment for over a decade because the claims sounded too strange for the journals that mattered. A researcher deployed cameras on the deep-sea floor for 3 years and captured 600 frames of darkness before finding the creature that textbooks said could not be photographed alive. Two paleontologists destroyed each other's careers and each other's specimens in a feud that lasted decades and produced more damage than science. A philosopher dove underwater, watched octopuses build settlements out of shells, and proposed that cephalopods possess something resembling a mind, and the response from his own discipline was silence. A whale recording sat in a filing cabinet for years before anyone understood what it contained. Polar researchers separated by a century, one dying in a tent on the Antarctic ice, the other filling out questionnaires in a heated station, documented the same psychological collapse at the same point in the mission timeline. And an organism with a brain smaller than a poppy seed produces a material that the best-funded laboratories on the planet, after 40 years of trying, cannot replicate. 11 stories, 11 fields, 11 eras, different continents, different centuries, different organisms, and the same structure every time. A discovery existed before it was acknowledged. The gap between finding and recognition was not months, it was years, sometimes decades. And the cause of the delay was never ignorance, never incompetence, and never conspiracy. It was the system working exactly as designed. In August 2015, a consortium of over 270 researchers published the results of the largest replication effort in the history of the social sciences. The Reproducibility Project, coordinated by Brian Nosek at the University of Virginia and published in Science, had a premise that should not have been controversial. Take 100 psychology experiments from 3 of the field's most respected journals: Psychological Science, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and the Journal of Experimental Psychology, all published in 2008, and redo them. Same methods, same materials were available, high statistical power. See what holds up. 97 of the original 100 had reported statistically significant results. That is expected. Journals overwhelmingly publish positive findings. Negative results rarely make it to print. The question was whether those positive findings would survive repetition. 36 did. 36 out of 97. The effect sizes of the replicated studies were, on average, half the magnitude of the originals. 25 of the failed replications directly contradicted the published result. Not weaker effects, but effects pointing in the opposite direction. The remaining failures were inconclusive, underpowered to confirm or deny. Social psychology replicated at 23%. Cognitive psychology fared better at roughly 50%. Neither number was reassuring. An entire field had been constructing theories, designing interventions, and informing policy based on findings that, in many cases, did not hold up under a second test. This was not a fringe result published in an obscure journal. It appeared in Science. It was covered globally. And it did not come as a surprise to the people doing the work. Through informal channels, conversations at conferences, failed attempts in graduate labs, whispered warnings between colleagues, researchers had known for years that certain famous findings could not be reproduced. The elderly walking priming study, a pillar of social psychology taught in every introductory course, had failed replication twice by 2012. The Reproducibility Project did not discover the problem. It measured it, and the measurement was devastating. What it measured was the output of a system governed by a single incentive: publish. The phrase is publish or perish. It is not a metaphor. In most research institutions, career advancement, tenure, grants, lab space, graduate students depends on publication volume, not replication, not negative results, not the slow, unglamorous work of verifying what has already been claimed. The system rewards novelty. A paper that finds a new effect gets published. A paper that finds no effect does not. A paper that fails to replicate a famous result is, at best, an awkward correction. At worst, it is a career risk, because challenging a prominent lab means challenging the people who review grant applications. The result is predictable. Positive results flood the literature. Negative results vanish. Null findings, experiments that ran correctly but found nothing, sit in filing cabinets and hard drives, unpublished, uncited, invisible. Researchers call this the file drawer problem. It was first named in 1979 by Robert Rosenthal, a psychologist who calculated that for every published study showing an effect, there might be several unpublished studies showing no effect at all. The published record, then, is not a record of what was found. It is a record of what was publishable. And because only positive results are visible, the tools meant to aggregate evidence, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, the studies that governments and hospitals rely on to set policy, end up aggregating a biased sample. The bias is structural. Nobody designs it, nobody orders it. It emerges from incentives the way water flows downhill. A 2016 survey published by Nature asked over 1,500 researchers across all disciplines about reproducibility. More than 70% reported having tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's work. More than half had failed to reproduce their own. But fewer than 20% had ever been contacted by anyone unable to reproduce their findings. The failures were happening, the conversations were not. In 2023, more than 10,000 research papers were retracted globally, a new annual record, roughly tripling the total from just 3 years earlier. The previous record had been set the year before. The largest single source was Hindawi, a London-based subsidiary of the publisher Wiley, which retracted over 8,000 articles after discovering that its system of guest-edited special issues had been infiltrated by scammers posing as editors to publish fabricated work. But Hindawi was not the disease. It was a symptom. The retractions were driven in large part by paper mills, commercial operations that produce fabricated research for a fee. A paper mill generates a manuscript, sometimes from templates, sometimes using large language models, attaches it to a paying customer's name, and submits it to a journal. Some mills bribe guest editors. In early 2024, a Cambridge researcher named Nicholas Wise found postings by a Chinese paper mill called Olive Academic offering payments of up to $20,000 to journal editors willing to accept submissions. An investigation by Science and Retraction Watch identified more than 30 editors of reputable journals who had accepted such arrangements. Other mills fabricate the peer review itself, creating fake reviewer accounts that rubber stamp the submission. The fees paid by customers range from a few $100s for an authorship slot on a pre-written paper to tens of thousands for a custom manuscript placed in a high-impact journal. Estimates suggest that up to 2% of all papers published in 2022 came from paper mills. The scale is not artisanal, it is industrial. The retractions represent progress. Publishers are catching more fraud than before. But integrity experts are unambiguous. What has been caught is the visible fraction. The number of compromised papers still circulating in the literature, still being cited, still informing meta-analyses and systematic reviews that shape clinical guidelines and public policy. That number is unknown, and it is certainly larger. In 1975, a British economist named Charles Goodhart published an observation that was meant to apply to monetary policy. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. The principle is simple and devastating. If a government uses a specific economic indicator to guide decisions, people and institutions will optimize for that indicator rather than for the underlying reality it was meant to represent. Goodhart was talking about interest rates, but the principle is general. In education, when school funding depends on standardized test scores, teachers teach to the test. Scores rise. Measurable learning may not. In policing, when departments are evaluated by arrest numbers, officers make arrests that inflate statistics without necessarily reducing crime. In medicine, when hospitals are ranked by surgical mortality rates, some hospitals avoid admitting high-risk patients. The mortality metric improves, but the sickest patients end up somewhere with fewer resources. In every case, the metric moves in the desired direction. The reality behind the metric does not necessarily follow. Scientific publishing operates under the same logic, and has for decades. The metric is the number of publications. The proxy it was meant to represent is the production of reliable knowledge. The incentive structure ensures that researchers who publish more get tenure, grants, laboratory space, and graduate students. Researchers who publish less, regardless of the quality or significance of their work, are at risk. The system does not reward someone who spends 3 years replicating a famous result and confirming it. The system does not reward someone who spends 3 years replicating a famous result and disproving it. The system rewards someone who produces a new result. Any new result. The metric, publication count, no longer reliably measures what it was designed to measure. It measures the production of publishable units. Those are not the same thing. They have not been the same thing for a long time. Every story told on this channel fits the same template. Someone found something real. The finding existed before it was accepted. The delay between discovery and recognition was caused not by a villain, but by a system optimized for the wrong metric. The ocean floor was mapped decades before the mapper received credit, because credit flowed to the name attached to the publication, not to the person who did the work. A parasite's effect on behavior was dismissed for years. Because the finding was too disruptive for journals that rewarded incremental advances over paradigm shifts. Polar researchers documented the same psychological phenomenon a century apart, and the second group did not know about the first because the earlier observations were buried in expedition diaries that nobody indexed. Spider silk could not be replicated in a laboratory because the system optimized for protein chemistry, and the answer was in physics. In every case, the discovery was there. The system was not built to find it. The system was built to publish. The question this raises is not whether science works. It does. The Reproducibility Project itself is proof. Science examining its own failures is science functioning at its highest level. The question is narrower and more uncomfortable. If the system that produces and validates knowledge has a structural bias toward novelty over verification, toward positive results over null findings, toward volume over depth, then the buried record is not an accident. It is a predictable output of a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. 11 stories, one pattern, not conspiracy, design. There is a term in metascience, the field that studies how science itself works, for the cumulative effect of all these pressures. It is called the credibility crisis. Not because individual scientists lack credibility. Most of them are rigorous, careful, and honest. The crisis is that the system they work inside is structured to reward behaviors that undermine the reliability of its output. A researcher who publishes 10 mediocre papers in 3 years is, by every institutional metric, more successful than a researcher who publishes 1 transformative paper in 5. The first gets tenure, the second gets anxious. And the literature fills up with findings that were true enough to get past a reviewer, but not robust enough to survive a second test. The buried record grows, not because anyone buries it deliberately, because the filing system was never designed to retrieve it. Next month, the distance shrinks. The topics move closer: ecology, genetics, medicine, living scientists, living consequences. Closer to the surface, closer to you.